Codename Bond. The most famous Bond theory of all argues that James Bond isn't a man, but a codename handed to whichever MI6 agent currently holds the 007 designation. The theory says Bond and 007 are both job titles, and the man wearing them changes every few years. Supporters point to George Lazenby's first scene in On Her Majesty's Secret Service in 1969, where he turns to camera and says, "This never happened to the other fellow." They point to the fact that Sean Connery, George Lazenby, Roger Moore, Timothy Dalton, and Pierce Brosnan all look completely different, carry different mannerisms, even drink slightly differently, and somehow never visibly age across about 40 years of films. Meanwhile, M, Moneypenny, and Q stay physically continuous, treated as if they have always worked with the same agent. The theory also notes that when villains like Blofeld or Jaws return, they never recognize a different-looking Bond, which only makes sense if Bond is a different person wearing the same codename. The theory has been a fan staple since at least the 1990s on Usenet boards, picked up real momentum in 2000's message board culture, and now lives on Reddit. The franchise pushed back on all of this in 2012. Skyfall introduces the Bond family estate in Scotland and shows the headstones of Andrew Bond and Monique Delacroix Bond, which is the strongest piece of canonical evidence against the codename theory. The theory's holdouts have an answer for that, though. They argue the gravestones themselves could be part of MI6's brainwashing protocol, which leads directly to the next variant: Brainwashed Bond. Blogger D.F. Lovett published the most elegant fix for the codename theory in 2015, and Skyfall accidentally gave him the evidence he needed. Lovett's post on the blog What Would Bale Do, published in February of that year, argues that James Bond is a codename, but the agent does not know it. Each new Bond is brainwashed by MI6 to believe the cover identity is his real life, including childhood memories of Skyfall Lodge in Scotland. In this reading, Raul Silva, the former agent played by Javier Bardem, is the previous Bond, the only other man who survived the program. Supporters point to the fact that Silva repeatedly refers to himself and Bond as rats tortured and caged by M, which the theory reads as memory of the brainwashing facility. They point to how Silva knows Skyfall intimately and treats the location with emotional familiarity rather than research file familiarity. They point to the cuckoo metaphor Silva keeps applying to Bond, which fits a programmed replacement perfectly. This is the modern repair of the classic codename theory, and the reason the original refuses to die. It also gives the Daniel Craig films a hidden cyclical structure where every Bond is replacing the one that failed before him. The Multiverse Read. Some fans skip the codename rules entirely and argue every Bond actor exists in his own parallel universe. The multiverse theory treats each lead actor's run as a self-contained continuity, with Connery, Moore, Dalton, Brosnan, and Craig as variants rather than the same man. Supporters point to the technology jumps, from analog Cold War gadgetry to satellite warfare to nanobots, that can't fit one lifetime. They point to the tonal range, from straight Cold War espionage to Roger Moore's clown car comedy, that fits separate continuities better than a single character. The theory gained real traction during the Daniel Craig reboot era, when MGM publicly described Casino Royale as a reboot, which fans took as soft confirmation. This is the lazy man's codename theory, and the most viewer-friendly. It also lines up with how Marvel and DC have trained modern audiences to read recastings. Bond's PTSD mind. A growing reading of the franchise argues Bond's villains, Bond girls, and impossible escapes are all psychological projections of a man cracking under untreated trauma. The Medical Journal of Australia published a paper in 2015 that analyzed Bond's documented behavior across the films and diagnosed severe alcohol dependence and likely combat-related stress. The film Skyfall actually puts Bond's psychological evaluation on screen, with the words alcohol and substance addiction indicated, and pathological rejection of authority based on unresolved childhood trauma. In Goldeneye, the villain Alec Trevelyan asks Bond whether the vodka martinis ever silenced the screams of the men he had killed, a line the theory reads as the franchise admitting Bond uses alcohol to self-medicate. The harder version of this theory argues Bond's enemies are externalized shadows, each villain mirroring an aspect of Bond himself. Silva mirrors Bond as a discarded MI6 weapon. Trevelyan mirrors Bond as a fellow 00 turned traitor. Blofeld mirrors Bond's family wound. The theory turns the franchise into a long character study and explains why every Craig-era villain feels like a dark mirror of Bond himself. It's also the most defensible academically. By the way, if you're enjoying these so far, I post videos like this all the time and a subscribe would really help out. Thanks. The plastic surgery fix. One stubborn theory says the franchise actually almost filmed an in-universe explanation for the Connery to Lazenby switch and then deleted it. The original draft of On Her Majesty's Secret Service reportedly opened with Bond recovering from cosmetic surgery to disguise himself after faking his death at the end of You Only Live Twice in 1967. Producer Albert R. Broccoli has been cited as considering and ultimately rejecting that plastic surgery cold open during pre-production of the 1969 film. The You Only Live Twice ending sees Bond fake his own death with a staged burial at sea, which makes a post-fake death facelift a logical narrative beat. The theory persists because Lazenby wears reading glasses and adopts a different accent in his scenes with Blofeld, which fans read as residual surgical disguise. This is the in-universe theory the franchise almost made canon. Tracy's long shadow. Tracy Bond is the only character whose death gets referenced by 4 different Bond actors, and one theory says that thread is the franchise's hidden continuity spine. Tracy DiVincenzo, played by Diana Rigg, marries Bond at the end of On Her Majesty's Secret Service in 1969, and is murdered by Irma Bunt and Blofeld minutes later. Supporters point to Sean Connery's Bond opening Diamonds Are Forever in 1971 by hunting Blofeld across the globe, which the theory reads as direct revenge for Tracy's death. They point to Roger Moore's Bond visiting Tracy's grave at the start of For Your Eyes Only in 1981, a sequence that ends with him killing a Blofeld stand-in by dropping him down an industrial chimney. They point to Timothy Dalton's Bond in License to Kill in 1989, reportedly telling Felix Leiter that the same loss had happened to him a long time ago. The theory argues that the Tracy through-line is the strongest argument against the codename theory, because no franchise would build a 40-year revenge arc around a man who isn't the same man. Tracy is the single longest-running emotional thread in the franchise, and the strongest same-man anchor. This theory matters because it pushes back on every codename argument viewers just heard. 006's faked death. Alec Trevelyan's on-screen execution in the GoldenEye cold open looks airtight, but one theory says it was never an execution at all. In 1995, GoldenEye opens at the Arkhangelsk chemical weapons facility, where Bond and 006 raid the Soviet base, and Trevelyan is apparently executed by Colonel Arkady Urumov with a shot to the head. The theory argues Urumov fired a blank round, and the execution was staged in advance, with Trevelyan and Urumov already partnered. Supporters point out that Urumov is later revealed to be a long-standing traitor, which suggests an earlier alliance with Trevelyan than the film admits. They point to Trevelyan's facial scarring in the third act, which the film implies came from the explosion that follows the cold open. The theory argues that scarring would not match a survivor of a headshot, even from a blank, so something else must explain it. They point to the fact that Bond and 006 had already set explosives in the facility, meaning Trevelyan had a known escape window built into the operation. This theory gives GoldenEye a hidden conspiracy that runs years before the film starts. It also turns the cold open into Bond's biggest professional failure, since he walked away from a partner who was already turned. Dolly's phantom braces. A huge percentage of Moonraker viewers swear they remember Dolly wearing braces, and the film evidence says they never existed. Moonraker, in 1979, introduces Dolly, played by Blanche Ravaillac, as the petite girlfriend of the metal-toothed assassin, Jaws. Their meet-cute involves Jaws being saved from rubble, and the joke, as remembered, is that Dolly smiles to reveal full metal braces matching Jaws' teeth. On screen, Dolly's teeth are unadorned and white. There are no braces. Blanche Ravaillac has publicly confirmed she never wore braces in the role, and production photographs from the 1979 shoot also show no braces. The theory reframes this as one of cinema's purest Mandela effects, with thousands of viewers holding identical false memories of a joke that was never in the film. This is the lightest entry on the list, and it lets viewers test their own memory in real time. Carver's real-world twin. The Tomorrow Never Dies villain, Elliot Carver, was modeled on a real media tycoon, and that tycoon's actual death scene is hiding in the film. Tomorrow Never Dies, released in 1997, stars Jonathan Pryce as Elliot Carver, a media mogul who fakes global news to start a war between Britain and China for ratings. Screenwriter Bruce Fierstein has acknowledged that Carver was directly based on real-life media baron Robert Maxwell, who was found dead under disputed circumstances in November of 1991.
1991. Maxwell's body was recovered from the Atlantic Ocean off the Canary Islands after he disappeared from his yacht, the Lady Ghislaine. His death was officially ruled accidental, but reporters and biographers have long argued it was tied to his collapsing financial empire. Carver's death in the film also happens on a yacht-like stealth ship in the South China Sea, killed by his own sea drill, which the theory reads as a deliberate Maxwell tribute. Some fans go further and argue the film is also commenting on Rupert Murdoch's expanding global media empire of the 1990s, with Carver's Carver Media Group network mirroring News Corporation's reach. This entry turns a Bond villain into a piece of real history. It also lands as eerily prophetic in the modern fake news era, which is exactly the discomfort the theory exploits.
Vesper was protecting Bond. Most viewers leave Casino Royale believing Vesper betrayed Bond, but one reading argues she was a triple agent saving his life from start to finish. Casino Royale in 2006 reveals Vesper Lind, played by Eva Green, has been working for Quantum because the organization kidnapped her boyfriend Yusuf Kabira and threatened to kill him. In Quantum of Solace in 2008, Bond discovers Yusuf is in fact a Quantum agent himself, a man who seduces and entraps Treasury and intelligence officers across multiple countries. That means Vesper was a target, not a thief. The theory argues that Vesper figured out Yusuf was Quantum before her death in Venice and deliberately drowned herself rather than let Bond's emotional compromise feed the organization. Supporters point to Vesper leaving her phone with Mr. White's number on it, specifically positioned for Bond to find after she is gone. They point to Vesper's final note ending with the words, "Forgive me," which the theory reframes as her protecting Bond from himself, not seeking forgiveness for betrayal. This theory reframes the most important emotional event in the Daniel Craig era. It also gives Vesper agency in her death, rather than treating her as a tragic pawn. Pussy Galore's real story. Ian Fleming's 1959 novel of Goldfinger gives Pussy Galore a backstory the films erased, and one reading argues the character makes far more sense with it. In Fleming's novel, Pussy Galore is the leader of an all-female crime organization called the Cement Mixers, based in Harlem. Fleming attributes her sexuality to childhood sexual abuse by a relative, framed in the novel's 1959 language. The theory argues that this backstory, removed from the 1964 film, recontextualizes the famous barn scene where Bond ends up with Galore as something far darker than the film implies. Fleming publicly responded to reader criticism by claiming Galore only needed the right man, a line modern critics cite as proof the conversion was always intended as written. This entry pivots from fan theory to genuine textual analysis, and it lets the channel acknowledge the franchise's documented difficulties with the character. Elektra's hospital ending. The World Is Not Enough originally ended with Elektra King alive in a mental institution, and one theory argues that ending is still secretly canon. The World Is Not Enough, in 1999, stars Sophie Marceau as Elektra King, the oil heiress who fakes her own kidnapping and manipulates Bond into killing her enforcer, Renard. The original ending, drafted during production, would have shown Bond visiting Elektra at a psychiatric facility where she was being treated for the Stockholm Syndrome she had successfully faked. The ending was scrapped before filming, with producers deciding it was tonally inappropriate for a Bond climax. The theory argues that the scrapped ending is still the truth of the character, with Bond shooting a body double or non-fatally wounding her and quietly committing her to MI6 custody. Supporters point to the actual scene of Elektra's death, which is unusually clean for a Bond villain death, with Bond saying, "I never miss," but the wound shown ambiguously. They point to Renard's death later in the film as unambiguously fatal by comparison, which the theory says proves the Elektra shot was deliberately staged for ambiguity. They point to Bond's emotional reaction after the kill, treated as grief rather than triumph, which the theory reads as guilt over committing a woman he loved. This is one of the rare cases where a deleted ending fundamentally changes a character's fate, and the theory weaponizes that gap. It also reframes Elektra as one of Bond's most successful villains, because if the theory is right, she survives him. Bond survived No Time to Die. No Time to Die ends with what looks like the unambiguous death of James Bond, and one theory argues every frame of that ending is engineered to leave a way out. No Time to Die in 2021 ends with Bond, played by Daniel Craig, standing on the rooftop of Saffin's missile silo as British naval missiles strike. Bond is infected with Heracles nanobots coded to Madeline Swan's DNA, meaning any contact would kill her and their daughter Matilda. He chooses to stay behind. Supporters of the survival theory point to the fact that the closing sequence never shows Bond's body. We see only the missile impact and the resulting fireball. They point to the title card, "James Bond Will Return," appearing in the closing credits, the standard franchise sign-off never used after a definitive in-universe death.
They point to producer Barbara Broccoli publicly stating that whoever plays Bond next will be a fresh interpretation, which the theory reads as deliberate ambiguity rather than confirmation. They point to the rooftop where Bond stands collapsing into water before the impact, which fans argue creates a survival window through the silo's lower flooded chambers. They point to director Cary Joji Fukunaga admitting that the team filmed multiple alternate endings before settling on the final cut. They point to the Russian submarine and Royal Navy vessel shown in the scene, either of which could have extracted a wounded Bond. The counter-evidence is also public. Fukunaga has said the death was the intended ending, and that the creative team deliberated heavily before committing to it. So the official position is that Bond is gone. The theory's position is that the franchise hasn't actually closed the door, and that the next film will exploit exactly that gap. This is the closer, because it's the only theory on the list where the franchise itself hasn't made its choice final. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing so you catch every new video. Thanks for watching.